Welcome to, or welcome back to, the Agatha May Detective Agency. I'm Agatha May, and I'm so glad you're here. Before we get started, I have an announcement to make. There is a new member perk available, and it's a monthly newsletter. And it won't be about true crime, but about the life I have outside of crime. Well, talking about crime. It'll be about cooking, reading, gardening, thrift store shopping, my weird collections, music, shows and movies, crafts, household stuff, and maybe a few random thoughts from me. And even though the newsletter isn't centered on true crime, some of it will sneak in, mostly in the shows I watch. I have the January newsletter available now at agathamay.com, and it is available for everyone. Subsequent newsletters will be for members only and will include all levels of membership: Bess Marvin, George Fain, and Nancy Drew. To be transparent with all of you, if it wasn't for you members, I couldn't have the channel that I have now. I am squeaking out about $200 a month doing this, and this is the only job I have going on at the moment. A good chunk of what I make is from memberships, so thank you to those who are keeping me going. For those of you who are unable to work a subscription into your budget, please keep watching, sharing, and commenting so the algorithm will push the channel out to more people. Memberships are available from $3 to $7 a month, and you can become a member on YouTube or on Patreon. But I prefer Patreon because they only keep 11% of your money, while YouTube keeps 30%. And I have a letter at the end of this month's newsletter that talks more about this. Now, on with the episode. John Paul Miller just couldn't shut up. Do you think John Paul ever stops to think that if he had only not insisted on preaching the day after Micah died, then people across multiple countries might not know about him? We might not have so many people talking about Micah had he just kept his mouth shut. His stupid little announcement about Micah's death is what ignited the true crime community. That's what got people's attention, because it was such a weird speech. He simply needed to not be center stage for one day, but he just couldn't help himself. And I think he couldn't because he is impelled to always try and control the narrative. Everyone needs to see things the way that John Paul Miller sees things. Except he isn't controlling the narrative now. Now there are thousands of people controlling it, including the media. And most importantly, the FBI and federal prosecutors are controlling the narrative. John Paul thought he'd be able to convince everyone that his warped view of reality was the truth, but only a handful of people bought it. But why was John Paul so sure he could convince everyone to see things as he saw them? I think a lot of it is because of how much he's gotten away with in his life. In a sermon once, he told a story about how he'd received his first felony when he was 17 years old. He had taken a knife to school with the purpose of using it on other kids that had allegedly bullied him. And when he told the story to his congregation, it wasn't told with any contrition. He acted proud of it. He talked about how he was so tough because he was from Sockasty, and I don't even know what that's supposed to mean. But John Paul talked about how they all smoked Marlboro Reds and had faded rings on their back pockets from their skull cans. So, in John Paul's head, smoking and walking around with dip in your bottom lip is on par with being Mike Tyson. Except Weenie Boy had to take a knife to a fist fight. And he joked about his felony, and he made his congregation laugh, and I didn't detect a single bit of remorse from him. And did he go to juvie for his crimes? Well, not that he mentioned. Fast forward a couple of years, and he hit a woman with his truck twice. But it wasn't just him hitting her. He had driven through a neighborhood where the residents were putting out sandbags because of flooding, and they were yelling at him to slow down. I'm sure it's hard to imagine that John Paul Miller would ever be speeding. But anyway, the residents are yelling at him. He went home, put tape over his license plate, and went back and hit the woman twice. The second time he hit her, she ended up on the hood of his truck, and he drove with her on it for a fourth of a mile while she was hanging on. That's 1,320 feet. It would be like driving the length of a football field over 3.5 times. It wasn't a heat of the moment thing either. He had time to cool down after he'd left the first time, but instead he purposely tried to hide his identity and ran down a defenseless woman twice. And his only punishment was probation and 500 hours of community service. Then he got married to his first wife, Allison, and I can only imagine what she had to go through. What is on record is that he stalked her after she'd left him. On March 6, 2016, Allison filed an incident report that read, quote, "The victim reported that the offender constantly stalks and harasses her. The victim said the offender is her redacted, so ex-husband or estranged husband, and since their breakup, the offender will not leave the victim alone. The victim said the offender comes to her job, her new church, and very often to her home." And John Paul got away with it. He then climbed a tree as a way to spy and then fell out and broke his arm. And then he later lied about it and had to make it sound like it was worse than it was. And in his story, he had ended up in a body cast with 12 broken bones. He told the court that he had climbed the tree as some weird ass way to convince Allison to have makeup sex with him. Like watching him shimmy up some tree is supposed to be an aphrodisiac. He'd also bought a house across the pond from her and had tried killing a tree because it was in his direct line of sight to her house. And John Paul got away with it. In an affidavit filed with the court, Allison said that John Paul had hired sex workers while they were married and admitted to her that he had sexually assaulted underage girls at his church. The girls he had assaulted were too scared to talk about it at the time. Allison tried reporting it to the police, and they told her that no one would believe her story because John Paul was a pastor. So John Paul got away with it. During their divorce, he lost a large part of his church congregation, but he managed to build it back. John Paul married Mica Francis, and we've seen the list of abuses that she had to endure. From her own words, when he wasn't drugging her food, he was withholding food from her. He wouldn't let her sleep, he called her horrible names, and used her faith against her. He spoke negatively about her from the pulpit, controlled her finances, and controlled who she could talk to and where she went. He hired sex workers and had sexual encounters with homeless people and forced Micah to participate. He took over her social media and pretended to be her. He had her committed based on lies and coercion, and then stole her vehicle, purse, and phone. He put deflation razors in her tires, put trackers on her vehicle. He followed her and had her followed. And John Paul got by with it until he opened his big mouth, until he stood on the stage of his church and told the congregation that Micah was mentally ill and her death was self-induced. And he said it without a single tear and without seeming as though he was even slightly sad about it. He didn't announce her death just once that day either. He preached a sermon, cracking jokes through it, and then announced her death, and then preached another sermon and made jokes through it, and then announced her death. Then John Paul lost any visitation rights with his children, and that was the beginning of him finally having to face consequences for his actions. And two extremely brave women filed lawsuits against John Paul for sexually assaulting them when they were teenagers and against his father for allowing it to happen. Those lawsuits are ongoing, and the women have already won a default judgment against Reginald Wayne Miller because he couldn't even be bothered to go to court and try and defend himself and his son. But John Paul didn't stop trying to control the narrative. He began using fake personas on social media to again try and sway people's opinions. He was able to convince some people, who always seemed to be able to run faster than any intelligent thought chasing them, to stand up for him and take his side. They were and are an insignificant handful compared to the people who have spoken out against him. He again lost the majority of his congregation, and he's now left with about 20 people who attend his church. They are also an insignificant handful compared to his previous congregation numbers, 97% less. Can you imagine if 97% of the people in your life who once supported you suddenly stopped, and it was because of your own actions? John Paul released doctored medical records of Micah's to try and prove that she was so mentally ill that she'd ended her own life. But he made mistakes in the records and included information in the files that couldn't be true. He gave interviews about how he loved Micah more than anyone, and that he had never abused her in any way. He'd never done anything to her tires, she must have just driven over something. And he had only hired a private investigator to make sure she wouldn't buy a gun. He never put trackers on her vehicles, and then he told those lies to the FBI, and they didn't believe him because they had proof otherwise. So he was indicted on charges of cyberstalking and lying to the investigators. So now, for the first time in his life, it's looking as though John Paul is beginning to face actual legal consequences for his actions. and it also looks as though he's going to try to talk his way out of it. I don't know if he can even summon up enough humility to realize that he's not going to win. After his arraignment and knowing about the tons of money and valuables that the FBI found in his safe, and watching the prosecutors at their press conference that day, I think that the FBI has a lot more on him than just his current charges. I think this is only the beginning of the consequences that John Paul Miller is going to have to face. In a booklet that he wrote titled, "It's Not My Fault, LOL," he wrote this, quote, "The harvest that I am seeing in my life has come from the seeds that I have sown. I will not get a harvest based on the seeds that my boss has sown. So if I don't like what I've been dealing with the past few years, I must change the seeds that I've been sowing," end quote. And as much as I'd like to think that by now, John Paul should recognize that what he's facing is a direct result of the seeds he's sown, that the patch of thorns and briars and bindweed are all results of his actions. But I have a feeling that he will never admit or accept responsibility. Thank you so much for joining me for another episode in the Mica Francis case. I'll be back soon with Chapter 2 in the Charity Bialis case. Until then, stay safe and be happy.